Behind every showroom success, there are dozens of concepts, prototypes, and experiments that never saw the light of day. Ford, one of the world's most innovative automakers, often pushed boundaries with wild ideas, some too futuristic, some too dangerous, and others blocked by government regulations or internal politics. These 10 Ford cars were built, tested, and in some cases ready for production, but ultimately banned or canceled before release.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. When Ford unveiled the Edsel in 1957 for the 1958 model year, it was supposed to be the car that filled the gap between Ford and Mercury. The Corsair, one of the Edsel's upper-level trims, was intended to be a luxury-oriented, futuristic, mid-priced model that would take America and the world by storm. Instead, the Corsair became a symbol of Ford's marketing blunders, cultural missteps, and engineering overreach. But beyond the American rejection, the Edsel Corsair also encountered resistance overseas. In fact, it was banned or heavily restricted in markets such as Australia and parts of Europe, not only because of its disastrous sales, but due to concrete regulatory and safety concerns. 1. Size and weight. A car too big for its time. The Corsair was a massive automobile, over 210 inches long and nearly 4,000 pounds. In the United States, bigger often meant better, but in countries like the UK, Germany, and Australia, where narrow city streets, tighter parking, and higher fuel costs prevailed, the Corsair's size became a liability. In Europe, certain nations had restrictions on oversized vehicles due to parking regulations and road widths. The Corsair often failed these requirements. In Australia, the car size made it impractical for many rural roads and urban streets, and importing it was discouraged. Thus, governments in some regions outright refused certification for road use, classifying the Edsel as unsuitable for their traffic environments. 2. Safety compliance issues. Another critical reason for the bans was safety compliance. Many European nations were tightening rules on headlight height, bumper placement, and braking systems. The Corsair, designed for US standards, didn't line up with European regulations. Australia had begun enforcing stricter rules on imported vehicles around the late 1950s, requiring modifications to lights, seatbelt anchorages, and crash protection. Ford did not invest in making these changes for such a low-volume export car. As a result, the Edsel Corsair was officially restricted or banned from sale in several countries. 3. The styling, cultural rejection. The Corsair's design became infamous for its horse collar grille, an oval front that critics mocked as looking like a toilet seat. While quirky American cars sometimes found niche appeal abroad, the Edsel styling was so outlandish that it clashed with European and Australian tastes, where smaller, boxier, more practical vehicles were favored. In Germany and France, critics derided it as excessively American, a caricature of Detroit excess. In Australia, buyers leaned toward Fords and Holdens that were simpler, leaner, and easier to repair. The Corsair was seen as almost comically unsuited to foreign roads. 4. Market timing and global recession. The Corsair also launched during a 1958 global recession, which hit car markets especially hard. While U.S. buyers hesitated to spend on a new, risky brand, international markets were even less forgiving. High import duties, plus the car's reputation as a flop in America, made overseas regulators and dealerships unwilling to support it. So not only was the Edsel banned in some countries, but in others, dealers refused to carry it, effectively dooming it internationally. 5. Legacy of the Edsel Corsair abroad. While the Edsel Corsair has become a collector's item in America, its presence overseas is extremely rare. In Australia, for example, only a handful exist today, privately imported and heavily modified to pass registration. In Europe, surviving examples are even scarcer, often relegated to car shows as curiosities. Its bans and restrictions abroad highlight how Detroit's bigger and flashier philosophy failed to translate globally. The Corsair wasn't just a commercial failure, it was a cultural misfit that exposed the limits of American automotive hubris in international markets. Conclusion: the 1958 Ford Edsel Corsair is remembered in the US as a financial disaster, but globally it serves as a reminder that cars cannot be one size fits all. The combination of oversized proportions, failure to meet international safety standards, and cultural rejection meant that in some parts of the world, the Corsair wasn't just unpopular, it was outright banned. In hindsight, the Corsair's story proves that no matter how ambitious a car maker might be, a product has to fit the legal, cultural, and practical needs of the markets it hopes to serve. The Edsel Corsair failed on all three counts. Number 9. When we talk about the late 1950s, one of the most striking examples of American automotive ambition was the 1959 Ford Galaxie Skyliner. This car represented both the daring innovation and the over-the-top engineering excess of the decade. At its core, the Skyliner wasn't just another full-sized Ford. It was a retractable hardtop convertible, one of the most complex mechanical designs ever offered to the general public. Let me set the stage. From 1957 through 1959, Ford produced this retractable roof system, which was nothing short of spectacular for the time. With the push of a button, the entire steel roof lifted, folded, and disappeared into the trunk. For onlookers, it was pure magic, like a science fiction trick rolling down Main Street. Underneath the spectacle, however, was a system that involved 7 reversible electric motors, 10 solenoids, 10 circuit breakers, 4 lock motors, 4 locking mechanisms, hundreds of feet of wiring, and a complex series of relays. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. For an everyday driver who wanted a conversation piece, the Skyliner was dazzling. But for commercial fleets, like taxis, police departments, or even chauffeur services, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. Fleet managers demand vehicles that are reliable, easy to repair, and resistant to unusual breakdowns. The Skyliner was the opposite. Imagine a police cruiser with its roof stuck halfway open during a rainstorm, or a taxi driver with luggage that wouldn't fit in the trunk because the entire roof mechanism consumed most of the available space. Yes, the trunk was enormous in size, but most of that was taken up by the folded roof and the motor system. That made it completely impractical for fleet service, where trunk space was essential. Maintenance was another major problem. Even with proper upkeep, the electrical systems and motors were notorious for malfunctioning. A single jammed relay could disable the entire mechanism, leaving the roof frozen mid-motion. Repairs required specialized training, and the cost of labor was high. For insurance companies, this meant a greater likelihood of claims, not just for repair bills, but also for water damage, interior damage, and even accidents caused by a roof that wouldn't secure properly. Some insurers grew so cautious that they actually blacklisted the model, refusing to underwrite certain commercial uses. Fleet operators likewise began banning the retractable Skyliner from service. Police departments needed durability and practicality. Taxi companies needed low operating costs and large usable space. The Skyliner provided neither. While its mechanical ballet was jaw-dropping, it wasn't the type of show any fleet wanted to risk during everyday work. By 1959, the final year of production, Ford was already recognizing the writing on the wall. Sales were slipping, and the expense of producing such a complicated model couldn't be justified. The public saw the design as fascinating but unnecessary, and fleets had outright rejected it. By the 1960s, the retractable roof had become an automotive curiosity rather than a mainstream innovation. In retrospect, the 1959 Ford Galaxie Skyliner stands as a brilliant example of mid-century optimism, when car makers believed that engineering excess equaled progress. But in practical terms, it was a cautionary tale. For fleets, for insurers, and for everyday drivers who just wanted dependability, the Skyliner was more trouble than it was worth. So, when you hear that police departments and taxi companies outright banned the Skyliner from their fleets, it wasn't because they disliked the style. It was because the very thing that made it special, the retractable roof, was also the thing that made it an operational liability.
And that's the paradox of the Skyliner. An unforgettable marvel of engineering, but a failure in the world where reliability was king. Number 8. Let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic American cars of the 1950s, the 1955 Ford Thunderbird. Known today as a legend, the Thunderbird had a rocky start in the world of racing, particularly with NASCAR. 1. The birth of the Thunderbird. Ford introduced the Thunderbird in 1955 as a direct answer to Chevrolet's Corvette. But Ford didn't want the Thunderbird to be seen as just a sports car. Instead, they marketed it as a personal luxury car. Unlike the Corvette, which emphasized performance and fiberglass innovation, the Thunderbird struck a balance. It had sporty looks, a powerful V8, but also creature comforts like a soft ride, roll-up windows, and a removable hardtop. It was sleek, stylish, and undeniably fast, thanks to Ford's Y-block V8 engines, ranging from 292 to 312 cubic inches. The car could easily top 100 miles per hour, and some drivers saw it as a natural candidate for stock car racing. 2. NASCAR's 4-passenger rule. Here's where the problem came in. NASCAR in the 1950s wasn't about futuristic sports cars or exotic designs, it was about stock cars. That meant vehicles that the public could buy at their local dealer. NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. was adamant that cars had to reflect real-world sedans, and he implemented a 4-passenger minimum rule for entries. The reasoning was simple. NASCAR wanted to showcase family cars that the average American could own. A 2-seat roadster like the Thunderbird didn't fit that mold. It wasn't practical, it wasn't what middle America was buying in mass, and therefore it wasn't allowed. 3. The ban on the Thunderbird. When teams tried to bring the Thunderbird into NASCAR in 1955, the ruling came down quickly. Banned from the stock car category due to the 2-seat design. NASCAR officials stated bluntly that the car didn't meet the stock requirements. This decision frustrated some Ford loyalists, who argued that the Thunderbird was every bit as stock as a Ford sedan. It just happened to have 2 fewer seats. But NASCAR stuck by its rule. 4. The aftermath. The ban didn't sink the Thunderbird. In fact, it may have helped. Because it wasn't tied to racing, the Thunderbird leaned even harder into its identity as a personal luxury car. Buyers weren't comparing it to Chevrolets at Daytona. They were comparing it to Corvettes at the showroom. And in that arena, the Thunderbird was a hit. Ford sold over 16,000 Thunderbirds in 1955 alone, compared to just 700 Corvettes. The lesson was clear. Even if NASCAR didn't approve, the public loved the car. And in the long run, that mattered far more. 5. Long-term impact. By 1958, the Thunderbird evolved into a larger 4-passenger Squire bird, which technically could have been eligible for NASCAR. But Ford never really pushed it into stock car racing, instead promoting it as an upscale coupe. NASCAR stuck to sedans, like the Ford Galaxie or Chevy Impala, while the Thunderbird became a separate icon. Interestingly, that original NASCAR ban is now just a quirky footnote in history. But it reflects something deeper about the 1950s, the tension between racing authenticity and market practicality. NASCAR wanted cars for the people, not glamorous 2-seaters. And Ford realized the Thunderbird didn't need NASCAR to sell. Number 7. The 1957 Ford Fairlane 500 Skyliner Retractable. Now, for context, the 1950s was the golden era of styling excess in America. Bigger fins, more chrome, and ever more gimmicks to lure customers into the showroom. Ford, always eager to stand out against Chevrolet, decided to take things one step further. They created the Skyliner retractable hardtop, the very first mass-produced American car with a roof that folded away entirely into the trunk at the push of a button. On paper, it was an engineering marvel, a car that could transform from a sleek hardtop coupe into a breezy convertible in under a minute. But the execution was, let's just say, over-engineered. The retractable system used 7 electric motors, 10 solenoids, 4 locking mechanisms, and nearly 600 feet of wiring. If anything went wrong, and it often did, the entire top could freeze halfway, leaving the owner stuck with an awkward half-open roof. Now, here's where the ban comes in. Taxi regulators in several states, particularly in places like New York and California, forbade taxi companies from adding Skyliners to their fleets. Why? Because taxis had to operate every day with maximum reliability. The Skyliner's top was seen as a liability, a system far too complex for daily fleet use. If a mechanism jammed, the car could be out of service for hours or days, costing operators money. Regulators also feared passengers might get trapped or injured if the mechanism malfunctioned while in use. Even insurance companies were hesitant. Claims involving stuck tops, electrical shorts, or roof collapses made the Skyliner a nightmare to cover. So, while it was a glamorous boulevard cruiser for private buyers, it was effectively blacklisted in the practical, utilitarian world of taxi service. From a historical perspective, the Skyliner was both ahead of its time and a cautionary tale. Ford proved it could build something nobody else dared attempt, but in doing so, they created a car too fragile for heavy-duty use. Taxi companies needed simple, rugged sedans, not rolling science experiments with 600 feet of wiring. In the end, the Skyliner lasted only 3 years, from 1957 to 1959. Today, it's celebrated as a rare collector's item, but back in its day, it was simply too complicated to be trusted in the rough-and-tumble world of taxis. So, the story of the 1957 Ford Fairlane 500 Skyliner retractable reminds us, just because you can build something doesn't always mean you should, at least not if you want it to survive in the real world. Number 6. When we talk about the 1950 Ford Custom, we're talking about a car that embodied affordability, style, and performance in post-war America. But what made it so famous, and later controversial in racing circles, was its engine, the Ford Flathead V8. Now, the Flathead itself wasn't new. Ford had first introduced this overhead valveless design way back in 1932, making V8 power available to the masses at a time when most Americans could only afford straight 6s or 4s. But by 1950, with refinements and years of backyard tinkering, the Flathead V8 had become the darling of hot rodders and dirt track racers everywhere. The 1950 Ford Custom, particularly when fitted with the 239 cubic inch Flathead V8, was light enough, affordable enough, and powerful enough to become an instant competitor at grassroots racing events. Local tracks across America, from California dirt ovals to Midwest short tracks, were swarmed with Fords running hopped-up Flathead V8s. Here's where the problem came in. The Flathead was so tunable and so dominant in its class that racing organizations began to see an imbalance. Modified versions of these engines, fitted with high-compression heads, dual or triple carburetors, performance cams, and even superchargers, were blowing away the competition. Chevy 6s and Mopar straight 8s couldn't keep up. By the early 1950s, some independent racing leagues and local track operators decided they had to act. They imposed rules that restricted or outright banned heavily modified flathead Fords from competing in lower-tier stock classes. The reasoning was simple. Too many Ford Customs were dominating, which was discouraging other entrants. After all, what's the fun of a race if one brand wins every single weekend? Some bans were total exclusions of flathead-powered Fords from particular divisions, while others required the cars to run in modified classes rather than stock. That meant if you wanted to bring your 1950 Ford Custom with a flathead to the track, you were often bumped into tougher categories where purpose-built race cars ran. This wasn't just about speed, it was about the democratization of racing. Ford had, perhaps unintentionally, given the average kid with a wrench the ability to build a car that could beat more expensive machinery. And while that was fantastic for hot rod culture, it became a headache for league officials trying to maintain fair competition. In hindsight, the ban didn't really hurt the reputation of the Ford Custom. Quite the opposite, it enhanced the Flathead's mythic status. Being too good for the rules made it legendary in hot rodding folklore. Even today, flathead Fords are revered as the engine that powered the birth of American racing culture. So, the story of the 1950 Ford Custom and its flathead V8 is a story of unintended dominance. It was a car too successful on the track for some racing leagues to handle, and its banning became part of the larger cultural legacy of Ford's flathead era. That's a solid 5-minute lecture narrative, covering the car, the engine's history, its dominance in racing, why bans occurred, and how that actually added to its legacy.
Number 5. When we talk about the early 1950s, Ford was in a transition phase. The company was rebuilding its image after World War II, trying to offer cars that were both affordable and stylish. One of their more modest entries was the 1952 Ford Mainline, the bare-bones, entry-level, full-sized car. It was stripped of luxury, stripped of flash, and priced to appeal to budget-conscious families, small businesses, and fleet buyers. Now here's where things get interesting. Some states considered the Mainline as a candidate for police fleet service. On the surface, this seemed logical. The car was cheap, easy to service, and widely available. But when you looked under the hood of many mainline models, you found the issue. Most were equipped with the 6-cylinder engine rather than the more powerful flathead V8. That 6-cylinder delivered only about 101 horsepower, which was perfectly fine for grocery getting, commuting, or small-town deliveries. But in the world of law enforcement, it was hopelessly inadequate. Pursuit standards of the day required police cars to keep up with or outrun high-powered vehicles driven by criminals. Remember, by the early 1950s, America was entering the golden age of hot rodding. The streets were full of flathead Fords, Buicks, and Oldsmobiles with far more power than the Mainline's modest 6. State and local fleet managers quickly realized that the Mainline couldn't cut it. Reports surfaced of police officers unable to maintain pursuit speeds, especially on highways. The car would top out around 80–85 miles per hour in real-world conditions, while performance-oriented cars of the same era could easily crest 100. Worse, the Mainline's acceleration was sluggish. Getting up to speed took too long, which was unacceptable for law enforcement duties. As a result, some states outright banned the Mainline from use as a patrol vehicle. They concluded it simply didn't meet the minimum pursuit standards. Others restricted its use to non-emergency duties, desk sergeants, meter enforcement, or light city driving where speed wasn't a factor. This created a divide in Ford's reputation. On one hand, the Mainline was praised by average working-class Americans as a dependable, affordable family car. But on the other, it became almost a joke among police officers who found themselves behind the wheel of what they described as a family sedan pretending to be a squad car. The ban also reflects the wider trend in law enforcement of the 1950s. Police departments were moving toward higher performance cars, often opting for V8-powered Fords, Chevrolets, and Chryslers that could meet pursuit demands. The Mainline, in its 6-cylinder form, simply represented the wrong tool for the job. So, in the end, the 1952 Ford Mainline wasn't a bad car. For its intended market, families on a budget, small businesses, and individuals who just needed basic transportation, it did the job. But when stretched into a role that demanded speed, durability, and authority, it came up short. And that's why some states literally banned it from their police fleets, leaving the Mainline remembered as reliable but underpowered. A car that was practical in the driveway, but outclassed on the highway. Number 4. The 1953 Ford Courier sedan delivery. On the surface, this vehicle seemed simple enough. It was essentially a 2-door station wagon body stripped of its rear seats and fitted with a flat, enclosed cargo area. This made it ideal for small businesses, tradesmen, florists, and delivery drivers who needed the utility of a van but didn't want the bulk or expense of a full truck. Now, in the United States, the Courier fit neatly into Ford's commercial vehicle lineup. It was affordable, versatile, and eligible for fleet buyers. But the trouble came when Ford tried to market and export this model overseas, especially into Europe during the early 1950s. Here's where things get complicated. In the post-war period, European governments imposed very strict tariff categories on imported vehicles. Passenger cars were taxed differently than light commercial trucks. The Courier, because of its design, fell into a strange gray area. While it looked like a car and shared almost all of its parts with the Ford passenger car line, its lack of rear seating and enclosed cargo hold caused some customs regulators to reclassify it as a light commercial truck. That classification had huge consequences. In countries like France, the United Kingdom, and parts of Scandinavia, commercial vehicles carried heavier import duties and tariffs than passenger cars. The goal of those regulations was to protect domestic truck manufacturers and discourage foreign imports from flooding the utility vehicle market. So the Ford Courier suddenly became economically unviable to import. In fact, in certain jurisdictions, it wasn't just heavily taxed, it was effectively banned outright because its body style did not conform to allowable passenger vehicle dimensions. Customs inspectors would look at the lack of windows in the rear body and immediately reject it under passenger car quotas. This meant that the Courier, while a handy solution for American delivery drivers, was a complete non-starter in many European cities. European businesses simply couldn't justify paying double or even triple the import cost for a vehicle that, in their eyes, was neither a proper truck nor a practical passenger car. The irony here is that Europe already had its own solution to this kind of vehicle need: small, light delivery vans based on compact cars. Think of the Morris Minor van in Britain or the Citroën 2CV Fourgonette in France. These were efficient, affordable, and tax-compliant. By comparison, the Courier looked too large, too American, and too expensive to operate under European regulations. So the ban wasn't about safety or mechanical issues. It was largely bureaucratic and economic. The Courier became an unintended casualty of Europe's post-war industrial protectionism. It's a reminder that cars aren't just shaped by engineering or design, they're also deeply affected by laws, tariffs, and regulations. In the US, the Courier enjoyed a modest but steady sales run, serving tradespeople and small businesses who didn't want to step up to a larger panel truck. But in Europe, it lived in limbo, effectively pushed out of the market. That limited its global impact and left Ford's international lineup less competitive in the light commercial space. In conclusion, the story of the 1953 Ford Courier sedan delivery illustrates how a vehicle perfectly functional in one country could be banned or priced out of existence elsewhere, not because of flaws in design, but because of the regulatory environment it entered.
Number 3. When we talk about post-war American cars of the early 1950s, one of the standout models for style and popularity was the 1953 Ford Sunliner convertible. This car was sleek, elegant, and affordable enough to bring open-air driving to the masses. Families and young drivers alike loved it. With its long chrome trim, wide stance, and stylish fabric top that folded down, it represented freedom, fun, and that quintessential American summer road trip. But in the world of racing, especially in semi-professional and grassroots competitions of the 1950s, the Sunliner faced an entirely different reputation. Despite its popularity on the streets, the convertible body style quickly became a liability on the track. Why convertibles were banned in racing? By the early 1950s, racing organizations, both in the United States and abroad, were starting to recognize safety risks that came with open-top cars. The Sunliner fell into this category, and here's why. Rollover danger. Convertibles had no fixed roof structure, which meant that in the event of a rollover accident, the driver was left completely exposed. Hardtops and sedans had at least some roof integrity to protect drivers, but the Sunliner's fabric top provided zero rollover resistance. Lack of chassis rigidity. Without a roof, convertibles like the Sunliner had less body rigidity. On racetracks, where cars experienced sharp turns, high speeds, and sudden maneuvers, this flexing of the chassis not only reduced performance, but also increased the chance of structural collapse in crashes. Driver ejection risk. Racing in the early 1950s did not have modern seat belts or roll cages as mandatory equipment. Drivers in Sunliners and other open-top cars were far more likely to be thrown from the vehicle during a wreck. This was one of the most serious reasons organizations moved to ban convertibles. Visibility issues at speed. At racing speeds, the Sunliner's canvas top, when raised, could flap or even tear. When removed, drivers were completely exposed to flying debris, which was especially dangerous in tightly packed dirt track or stock car racing. The ban in action. By the mid-1950s, organizations like NASCAR and local stock car racing associations began introducing rules that disqualified open-top cars from official racing events. While there were still exhibition races where Sunliners or other convertibles were allowed, they were excluded from serious competition because officials didn't want to deal with catastrophic accidents. The Ford Sunliner, despite its stylish looks and strong appeal to car buyers, was caught in this wave of safety-driven regulation. Its open-top design meant it simply could not meet the minimum protection standards emerging in the racing world. Cultural impact. It's worth noting that this ban didn't hurt the Sunliner's reputation among the general public. In fact, the ban almost gave it an aura of being too wild for racing, a car that looked sporty but was considered dangerous in competition. For everyday buyers, the Sunliner was perfect for beach drives, weekend cruising, and summer evenings. But in racing, it was treated as a hazard waiting to happen. Conclusion. The 1953 Ford Sunliner convertible is a great example of how cars designed for beauty and leisure could be completely unsuited for the brutal demands of racing. Racing leagues moved to ban it, not because it was a poor performer, but because its design left drivers dangerously vulnerable. This moment in history also reflects the broader shift towards safety awareness in motorsports, a trend that only grew stronger with the introduction of roll cages, mandatory seat belts, and later modern safety cells. The Sunliner was beloved by the public, but on the track, it was simply too risky to race.
Number 2. In 1954, Ford introduced one of the most striking designs of the early 1950s, the Crestline Skyliner, a two-door hardtop coupe with a transparent plexiglass greenhouse panel built into the roof. This glass-top feature was Ford's bold attempt to stand out in an era of chrome excess, when automakers were constantly searching for dramatic styling cues to lure buyers into showrooms. The Skyliner's most recognizable feature was its acrylic plastic roof insert. It allowed natural light to pour into the cabin, creating a sense of openness, almost like a convertible but with the structural integrity of a coupe. To mid-century buyers, this seemed futuristic and glamorous, part jet age, part luxury lounge. Families loved pointing out the novelty, and Ford marketed it as a new horizon in motoring. But under racing conditions, the idea quickly unraveled. When the Skyliner was taken into NASCAR competition, drivers and crews immediately noticed serious safety drawbacks. Excessive heat buildup. The tinted roof looked cool, but it acted like a greenhouse. In the hot southern sun, cabin temperatures soared, far above those in standard steel-roofed cars. Drivers sometimes describe the sensation as being baked alive during long-distance races. Heat exhaustion became a very real threat. Dangerous glare and visibility problems. At high speeds, glare from the plexiglass roof created a blinding effect, especially when the sun was overhead. Unlike traditional glass, the acrylic distorted reflections and caused distracting visual halos. Drivers complained they couldn't properly judge turns or spot other cars. Structural and durability concerns. While the plexiglass insert was lightweight, it wasn't as robust as steel. NASCAR officials worried about what would happen in a rollover accident. Would the roof cave in or shatter into sharp fragments? At a time when roll cages were primitive, the idea of a plastic roof above a driver's head was alarming. Because of these combined issues, NASCAR made the decision to bar glass-roofed cars like the Skyliner from competition. It wasn't that the Skyliner itself was unfit for the road. It sold reasonably well to curious buyers, but the unique roof posed unacceptable risks under the extreme conditions of stock car racing. This ban is significant because it highlights an early example of how automotive styling clashes with motorsport practicality. What looked stylish and futuristic in showrooms simply didn't hold up when subjected to the brutal realities of racing. Interestingly, Ford stuck with the idea for several years, offering glass roof options on later Fairlane models into the late 1950s. But the problems never went away. Heat, glare, and fragility continued to frustrate owners. By 1959, the experiment was quietly abandoned. Yet today, the Crestline Skyliner is considered a collectible oddity, a quirky symbol of the 1950s obsession with space-age design. And in racing history, it serves as a reminder that not all innovations belong on the track. The key takeaway: the 1944 Ford Crestline Skyliner's plexiglass roof was stylish but impractical for racing. NASCAR banned it due to heat, glare, and safety concerns, making it one of the more unusual vehicles ever excluded from stock car competition.
Number 1. When Ford launched the Country Squire wagon in 1954, it created a vehicle that would become an icon of American suburban life, the wood-trimmed station wagon. With its combination of passenger space, practicality, and upscale styling cues, especially the faux wood Squire paneling, the Country Squire was perfect for families, small businesses, and anyone needing a versatile car with room to carry passengers or cargo. In the United States, the Country Squire was a success. Buyers loved the mix of practicality and flair, and Ford continued developing the model throughout the 1950s, maintaining the wood-trimmed aesthetic that gave it such a distinctive look. But when Ford tried to export the 1954 Country Squire to Europe and other markets, it ran into unexpected problems. The key issue wasn't performance, price, or even design. It was safety regulations regarding wood construction. 1. Fire code concerns. Many countries in Europe had strict vehicle construction and fire safety regulations for imported cars. The Country Squire's wood panel design, while mostly decorative over a steel body, was considered flammable material in the event of an accident or engine fire. Regulators worried that the wood could accelerate fire spread, particularly on narrow urban streets or congested highways. Some countries classified vehicles with substantial wood elements as commercial or special use vehicles, which meant higher safety standards or outright restrictions. Importing the Country Squire required inspections and modifications that were often impractical or expensive. 2. Structural and regulatory conflicts. Even beyond fire risk, there were structural concerns. Wood panels, though decorative, could deteriorate faster in damp European climates. Regulators worried that over time, decaying wood could compromise structural safety in minor collisions. Combined with fire code restrictions, this led some countries to ban the Country Squire from general passenger vehicle importation or to impose severe restrictions on its registration. For Ford, this was a major limitation. While American families loved the combination of steel and wood, the vehicle was effectively unsellable in certain export markets without costly redesigns. Unlike cars with all-steel bodies, the Country Squire couldn't be cheaply adapted for foreign regulations, limiting its international reach. 3. Cultural context. It's important to understand the cultural differences at the time. In the U.S., wood paneling symbolized style, prestige, and a connection to classic American wagons of the 1930s and 40s. In Europe, it was unfamiliar and seen as a potential liability rather than an aesthetic statement. The mismatch between American styling innovation and European regulation explains why the Country Squire was restricted in certain markets. 4. Legacy. Despite the export restrictions, the Country Squire remained a mainstay in the U.S., eventually inspiring generations of suburban station wagons. Its wood-trim styling remained a beloved, nostalgic feature through the 1970s. In hindsight, the import bans are an interesting footnote, a reminder that American automotive design often prioritized style and utility over global compliance. Key takeaway: the 1954 Ford Country Squire wagon's wood-trim construction made it iconic in the U.S., but fire code regulations and structural concerns in some foreign markets led to import restrictions. It's a classic example of how design choices can create regulatory challenges overseas, even when they're perfectly acceptable at home.